Hello, this is Pastor Paul Brunton from the Jesus Movement. This is the fourth lesson in a series called Believe It or Not, the Bible is Truth. You may have noticed that in the opening window that the name has actually been changed to A Journey to Faith. So this change has been put into place just simply because the journey of Abraham following the genealogy of Jesus all the way through this series is actually based on the book that I'm writing and producing called A Journey to Faith. So just to put this into a parallel with that, I've decided to change the name of this series to A Journey to Faith. So all upcoming releases will come out under the name A Journey to Faith. Now, just going into the lesson, we followed from the very first lesson. We had a look at the Abraham city of Ur, what it was like, and what he believed, and what happened there for him when he was called out by God to leave this city and the practice of idolatry behind, as God was calling him to make a nation of his own. In lesson 2, we followed his journey as he left from the city of Ur, and he went north west, and he followed the Euphrates River until he arrived in Haran, in northern Mesopotamia, which of course is today's Turkey. From there, he was called out to leave his family, and in fact he left his father Terah there, but he still continued to travel with his wife Sarai and his nephew Lot and their livestock. And in the third lesson, we follow his journey as he comes down from Haran in a southwesterly direction this time, and he passes into the land of Canaan. He receives the covenant promise from Abraham. Abraham receives the covenant promise from God, and he's shown this land and told that he will inherit this land and he will have many descendants. Once he arrives in the land, he builds a couple of altars to the Lord, one in Shechem and another one in Bethel, and he worships the Lord, and he keeps moving in a southerly direction until he arrives at the top of the Negev. So at the top of the Negev is the city of Be'er Sheva as we know it today, and it is that point in time where we begin today's lesson. The previous lessons, if you've missed them, are available on my YouTube channel, which is called the Jesus Movement, and you can avail yourself of those to watch those if you've missed them before you're watching this particular lesson. Okay, so beginning today's lesson, as I mentioned, we start off in Be'er Sheva. So I'm just going to pop up a picture here of Be'er Sheva. Now this is the entrance to the ancient city of Be'er Sheva as it is today, and in that picture you can see that there's a series of walls there at the entrance. There's some cobblestone sections, and then there's the dressed blocks that are above there. Now they represent two different periods. The blocks at the bottom that are not dressed are from the Canaanite period, and the dressed blocks on top, of course, are from the Israelite period, which comes much later. At the entrance there, you can actually see the well, and there's a trough that comes out from there. So they would water the animals, so people could actually water their animals without going into the city. So the bucket would be pulled up from the base of the well, and the water would be poured down that trough in order for the animals to drink. Now, part of the reason for showing this is that oftentimes when people read the Bible today, they don't believe that a lot of these places are real or what the Bible says is true. So this place is there in Israel for anyone who would care to go there, and you can walk the grounds there for yourself. Now, there's a picky there of me doing just that, and just gives you a little bit of evidence for that. Now, I'm just going to show you another picture. Now, this particular picture is from a tower that's there at ancient Be'er Sheva, and it's in the middle of the ancient city on top of the tell. And you can see the quite sophisticated ruins with all the streets and the different dwellings there. and that's looking in a southerly direction. So in the background you can see the top of the Negev, the desert, and you can see a couple of irrigated fields which are only full of plants because of the sophisticated irrigation systems that the Jewish people in Israel have developed in order to have crops in somewhat barren regions. Now, behind that tell, there's actually a bridge that you can see there, and underneath there passes an ancient river. At this point in time, when I was there, it was very, very dry and barren. So this is the same outlook that Abraham would have had. He would have come there and he would have stopped there because of the river which had the well beside there, and that would have given him the ability to both feed and to water his livestock. And of course the journey of the highway which travels through ancient Canaan, it was called the way to Shur, which is on the way to Egypt, and this was one of those locations along that highway. And of course they were all placed there because of the availability of water. Now I'm just going to pop up another slide there, and there's a bit of live film footage from what I was just mentioning. You can see the base of the river there passing on the bridge, but in this video you can actually see the shepherds there walking with their flocks. So they've got both sheep and goats that they're moving there. And you can get a picture of this from that barrenness and how dry and dusty it is, that this in fact would have been what it was like in the time of Abraham. And he too, as he was walking with his flocks and his herds, would have appeared just as what you're seeing here today, obviously without the bridge there. So this gives us a good idea of what the land looks like, and it gives a good idea of the journey that Abraham was up for as he was passing through the land of Canaan, specifically here at the top of the Negev. Now, he was travelling south, and he had come to this place, and he determined that there was an issue that he would have to deal with. So on this map you can see the journey as we've been following from the top of the map, which has come down from northern Mesopotamia where Haran was situated. Abraham travelled down and across the Jordan River into the land of Canaan, and then he followed across the hill country until you get down towards the bottom corner of the map there at Be'er Sheva, where we're talking about now. Now, the Bible tells us in Genesis chapter 12 verses 9 to 10, it says, "Then Abraham set out and continued toward the Negev. Now there was a famine in the land, and Abraham went down to Egypt to live there for a while, because the famine was severe." So we can question what was going on there. Obviously God had provided everything that Abraham needed, and he came down and kept travelling south until he got to this situation where in fact he was struck with a famine, which of course the famine is always associated with a drought because there's a lack of food and water. This in fact was actually a test for Abraham, the first test that he had in the land of Canaan. When this situation arose, he had two choices here. He could have remained there and trusted in the Lord that he would provide, or he could take the worldly decision and he could go looking for better fields or grounds for him to actually take care of his livestock. So in this particular situation, Abraham took the decision to continue further south. Now, if we have a look at an overall map of the region, it shows that fertile crescent there I've been showing in previous lessons, and you can see on the lower left there that when he leaves the bottom of the land of Canaan, he would then cross across the top of the Sinai Peninsula and across into what's known as the Nile Delta region for Egypt. And of course this was very fertile land. There was an abundance of water there. So in Abraham's worldly reasoning, he would have taken the decision that he would head down there, and that way he would be able to feed and water his livestock. But unlike today, when Abraham travelled across the Sinai Peninsula to get to the Nile Delta, all of North Africa was as fertile as the Nile Delta. So things then were not the same as today. So we often look at things in today's context and think, well, that would be a difficult or impossible journey. But in fact, when we understand what it was like in those times in context, we can sort of get a better picture of why that would happen. So this famine had struck Abraham in the Negev, which is a desert region, and he was in the land of Canaan. So obviously surrounding that region where he was, there was other areas that were still fertile. So evidence of this is given in the book of Genesis, when Abraham's nephew, a little bit later on in the story when they return, he compared the well-watered plain of Jordan. Now the well-watered plain of Jordan is actually at the bottom of the Dead Sea. Now today it doesn't look anything like that. It's extremely arid, and I'll show you some pictures of that later in the lesson. But at this point in time, it was a well-watered plain, implying that there was plenty of water, and of course there was plenty of grazing land for the animals. So in Genesis 13:10, it says, to the land of Egypt toward Zoar. So again, this is a very arid place today. So the descriptions that have been given us from the Bible are quite specific, but they're telling us the direction and the journey that Abraham was taking, and there was a provision there for his livestock. So faced with this famine, instead of trusting the Lord for his provision, the faith of Abraham had faltered at this point in time. So he sought his own solution, and as he approached Egypt, Abraham again failed to trust the Lord. So when we read the Bible at this point in time, up until he made this decision, we hear about how Abraham had been making sacrifices to the Lord. He'd built altars and made sacrifices. So he was praying and communicating with God for his needs, and God had provided. Now, when God sent a test for Abraham, that we don't hear about him building any altars or sacrificing or praying to the Lord until he returns much later on in the journey, and we'll again come to that as we travel further through this lesson. So at this point in time, as I said, he's approaching Egypt. He'd sought his own solution, but as he approached, Abraham failed to trust the Lord. Now Abraham journeyed down the way to Shur, the highway that linked the land of Canaan to Egypt through the Sinai Peninsula. So I'll just pop that map back up again there, and you can see that highway actually passes all the way across the top of the hill country through the land of Canaan, and it comes down to Be'er Sheva. And of course at the bottom there it travels across off the corner of the map, and this is what they call the way to Shur. So Shur is that region which is close to the Egyptian border on the, as it was in that day, on the other side of the Sinai Peninsula. So as he travelled westwards, again I'll pop that map up, you can see those dotted lines there. So as he travelled westward across the northern Sinai Peninsula, Abraham would have noticed an increased Egyptian presence as they began to encounter forts and troops that were stationed to protect the economic interests of Egypt. They actually mined extensively in this region. I'm aware that copper was one of those items in the Sinai Peninsula that was valued, and it was something that they mined. So they would have their troops in these regions to protect those interests, whether they were living there or not. So again, as he's approaching Egypt, you can imagine the closer and closer it gets, the more presence of Egyptian people he would have seen, and he would have encountered these protective forts and the soldiers as he approached the border. Now, as they go across the top of the Sinai Peninsula, the way to Shur comes across some lakes there, and one of them is called Lake Timsah. He would have had to skirt around the edge of this lake, and he would have come up to the eastern side of the Nile Delta. And of course, by this stage, he would have been in very, very fertile land. However, the problem was that because he was worried for himself, he was worried because of his wife's beauty, funnily enough. And as he headed towards the Nile River, deeper in the delta, his worry would have developed into fear as he conjured up the idea that the Egyptians would take her but kill him. And Abraham said to Sarai, and this you can find in the book of Genesis in chapter 12 in verses 11 to 13. Abraham said to Sarai, I know what a beautiful woman you are. When the Egyptians see you, they will say, this is his wife. Then they will kill me, but let you live. Say you are my sister, so that I will be treated well for your sake and my life, and my life will be spared because of you. So we can see from this scripture that Abraham is very much thinking about his own skin. And there's a few issues with that, of course, because it was his wife that the promise of the covenant to have a child for the future descendants would come through and from Sarai. So he would have got across to the Nile Delta, as we mentioned, and he would have been looking for some suitable grazing land for his animals. And their arrival would have generated a lot of curiosity because Abraham and his people, they were different. They were not from Egypt, so they would have been noticed for those differences. Also, they would have spoken a different language, and their clothing would have appeared different. Also, their grooming, like even how they wore their beards, etc. And the other thing was he had a lot of livestock, and the Bible tells us that Abraham had become quite a wealthy man. So this would, of course, ensure that the local people would have noticed him. Now, the court officials of the pharaoh, they also noticed him, and they saw Sarai and they praised her for her beauty, and they went and reported this to the pharaoh. Now, in due course, the officials came back and they sought her out. Inquiring and being told that she was only the sister of Abraham rather than his wife, they then took her to the harem in the palace. Now, instead of trusting God, Abraham's foolish choice led him from a famine in his own land which God had promised to him in a covenant, and he now walked himself into a much bigger problem, and that was that he was separated from his wife Sarai, through whom the Lord had promised offspring to whom would be given the land of Canaan. Now, the palace during the time of Abraham in ancient Egypt was not in the same location as where he had gone to graze his stock, because he was in a rural area on the eastern side of the Nile Delta. So you may ask, well, where was the palace? And this is when we sort of flip over from the Bible and we have a look at the historical and archaeological evidence to determine at that point in time in history whereabouts was the palace, and also to have an understanding of who was the pharaoh at the time. Now, the palace during the time of Abraham was in a city that was called Inbu Hedged, which is spelled I-N-B-U, Inbu, and the second half of the word, which is hyphenated, is H-E-D-J. Now, in the Hebrew language, this particular city was known as Noph, N-O-P-H. Now, you might wonder, how can I possibly know that? Well, the reason we can know that is because it's mentioned many, many times in the Bible. So I'll give you some references for that. And the first one is from the book of Isaiah, the prophet Isaiah, and it's in chapter 19, verse 13. If we then go to the prophet Jeremiah, it has several references. The first one is in chapter 2, verse 16, and then chapter 44, verse 1, chapter 46, verses 14 and 19. Then again we go to the prophet Ezekiel in chapter 30, verses 13 and 16, and finally the prophet Hosea, chapter 9, verse 6. So it's mentioned many, many times. Now, today, it has a different name, and you'll probably recognize this, and it's actually known as Memphis. Now, it wasn't called Memphis in these ancient days because the name Memphis was actually given to this during the time of the Greeks, which comes much, much later. So at this point in time, it's called Noph in the Bible, and in Egypt itself, it was called Inbu Hedge. Now, this particular city, it's actually situated about 20 kilometres or 12.5 miles south of Giza on the western side of the Nile River. Now, most of you would probably recognise the name Giza. It has the famous Pyramid of Giza, and of course this is where the huge Sphinx statue is also located. Now, because Sarai was taken into the Pharaoh's palace, in Genesis chapter 12, verse 15, it says, was taken into his palace. So we know that when she was taken from Abraham at the Nile Delta, she would have had to travel a reasonable distance to be taken to the palace itself. So that means she was separated from Abraham altogether, and she wouldn't have been able to actually come into contact with him. Now, history tells us that when people went into the actual harems, that they didn't actually get to be with the king or spend any time with the king for 12 months, because they would actually be taken to harem and they would be prepared, as they were called. So they would be taught the language, the customs, the culture. They would be groomed, they would be bathed, and their whole appearance would be transformed in a way that was pleasing to the pharaoh. So there was like a 12-month induction period. So at this point in time, Sarai would have been held into this environment, and she would have been prepared for the pharaoh. Now, the pharaoh would have known her and seen her, but there wouldn't have been any cohabitation at this point in time. So because Sarai was taken into the palace, the Bible actually tells us in Genesis 12, this time verse 16, that the king or the pharaoh treated Abram well for her sake. And Abram acquired sheep and cattle, male and female donkeys, men servants and maid servants, and camels. So we can see that he's being blessed by the pharaoh. He's being given an increase in his wealth because of the favour that he has for Sarai. So this seems quite extraordinary, doesn't it? It seems quite overwhelming that he's being rewarded so much for Sarai. So we could probably start thinking to ourselves, well, I wonder why that is. So if we ask ourselves, the next question most people want to know is, well, I wonder who this pharaoh was. So I'm just going to pop on the next slide, and I'm going to explain what I have learnt about who this pharaoh was. Now, I spent many years studying chronology and genealogy, and I've looked at many different kingdoms, and of course the Egyptian pharaohs, or the pharaonic dynasties as they're called, so the changes of the many different families over a long period of time, it's actually quite complicated. Now, there's a lot of controversy and differences in opinions about who pharaohs are, and I've actually taken this journey to follow right through the Bible and actually name all of them. So this is the beginning of that journey, and there's an alignment that we can put together, which is fairly probably more simple at the time of Abraham, but it gets more complex later on. And part of the reason for that is because most of the dating of pharaohs is actually based on those whom they've actually found in the past. Now, in recent times, there's been many more discoveries of pharaohs and pharaohs' tombs, and they keep adding them as time goes. However, the dating system hasn't actually changed, and there's actually errors in the dating system. So I'm going to come to that later on in this course, but at this point in time, we're just going to focus on the first pharaoh at the time of Abraham. Now, there's a general consensus about who this pharaoh is, because, as I said, there's not the complications that there were later on in history with the pharaohs, because there was these monumental pyramids and of course the Sphinx, and there was enough information from the history at that time, archaeological evidence, to point us to who the correct pharaoh was. So earlier in the series I mentioned about the dating of Abraham. Now, the most dating around Abraham occurs around 2000 BC. Some of it's a little bit earlier, some of it's a little bit later, but I'm going to base this on the birth date that I placed onto Abraham in previous lessons. So the general consensus that says that the particular pharaoh that was there at the time was Khufu. Now, Khufu is actually the picture on the far opposite side to me there, with the shorter headdress that's being worn there, and you can see the shape of his face is a more well-rounded face, and perhaps a little flatter in the actual features. Now, Khufu ruled over Egypt between the years of 1953 and 1930 BC. And he's the same man who built the Great Pyramid of Giza, which is in the picture there. Now, we have to remember that when Abraham came down here, he was no longer a young man. So if we're looking at the dates from around 2000 BC, we're now talking about dates which, if Khufu ruled until 1930, we're talking about dates that are approximately 70 years in difference. Now, we know that Abraham was 75 years old when he left his father Terah in Haran, because the Bible tells us this information. So it places us in approximately the right time. Now, Khufu, as I said, he died in 1930 BC, so it's a little bit before the time of Abraham. It's approximately that time. But it would have been just a few years earlier that he died before Abraham got down there. So rather than an older pharaoh who was interested in Sarai, it was actually his son who would have been interested in Sarai for the harem. Now, his son's name, I'm going to hazard a guess at the pronunciation, but it's Djedefre, and it's actually spelled Djedefre. So Djedefre immortalized his father Khufu by carving his face on the body of the Sphinx. So again, if you look at the pictures beside me, if you look at the face of the Sphinx and you look at the face of the statue on the far opposite side, you'll notice the distinct similarities between those features. Now, the head for the sun is the lower picture on this particular slide. You can see the fragment there because it's been broken, but you can see his features are much more pointed. His face is more elongated and considerably narrower. So we know from this and from more deeper studies that have been done, which I don't have time to go into for this particular lesson, that the person on the actual Sphinx is actually Khufu. But the thing is that the Sphinx wasn't built until after Khufu had actually passed away. So when Abraham went down there, it was between 1930 and 1919 BC that the son of Khufu, Djedefre, was actually the ruler there. So the pharaoh who was actually in power when Abraham went down with his wife Sarai was actually the son Djedefre, and he was actually building the Sphinx at that point in time. And of course the Pyramid of Giza was already built because his father had built it, and he would have been entombed in that pyramid at that point in time when Abraham and Sarai and his nephew Lot all arrived. So I've placed Abraham's date of his arrival in 1920 BC. So this is towards the end of Djedefre's rule, and this is the time when Abraham's wife was called to join his harem. So we have a look at this, and we can think about Sarai and think, well, if she arrived, with a what looks like shepherds at the end of the day, with all of their livestock in their tents, the wealth would have been noticeable in those times. But would she have particularly stood out as a person of interest upon arrival after walking across the desert to this pharaoh? So we must look at that and think, well, she was extraordinarily beautiful in order for this to happen. But when we read the Bible, we can look at the dating, and we know that the difference in age between Abraham and Sarai was in fact 10 years. So on this basis, if you want some perspective on how beautiful Sarai must have been, She was actually 65 years old when they went to Egypt. So that might change your outlook, because she wasn't a young and beautiful woman. She was a mature age woman who was beautiful. Now, we know from history that the pharaohs, they didn't particularly live very long. In fact, most of them were lucky to make it past the age of 35. So there was some, but the majority of them wouldn't get past that age. And in fact, the majority of them only ruled for about 15 years on average throughout that course of history. And in fact, if you have a look at the dates that these two kings ruled, the father Khufu ruled from 1953 to 1930, so that's 23 years, and the son Djedefre, he ruled from 1930 to 1919. So he was actually only in power for 11 years. So you can see those periods of rule are pretty short. So pretty extraordinary, isn't it, to think that a fairly young pharaoh would be choosing a mature age woman to join his harem at the age of 65. The problem that we've got in this situation, of course, is that we have a covenant with Abraham and Sarai with the Lord. So this situation couldn't remain. So God's everlasting covenant was only going to be fulfilled through their offspring. So the Lord was very displeased about what had actually occurred. So for him to be displeased, this sort of indicates to us that Abraham hadn't been obedient to the Lord when the famine was struck. So he pretty much failed this test that the Lord had sent him. So in Genesis 12, verse 17, it reads, "The Lord inflicted serious diseases on Pharaoh and his household." So, of course, there was an intention behind that, because the Pharaoh needed to know that something was wrong in order for an action to be taken. Now, after he received Sarai, of course, these events started to unfold, and these serious diseases came upon Pharaoh and his household. So Pharaoh learnt the reason for this. Now, you have to understand that they believed in many false gods in ancient times, and they were also very superstitious. So they would have looked at the circumstances and connected the dots together and said, Sarai's arrived. Now we've all got these diseases, so it must have something to do with her. Now, it says, the Bible says that he'd learnt that he'd been deceived. So one should imagine from that he'd questioned Sarai as to who she was, what her identity was. And so she must have revealed this to the Pharaoh or to the person who was responsible for her in the harem. As a consequence of this, the Pharaoh then sent for Abram. Now, we have to understand that Abram was nowhere near the actual palace. So once again, from that we can understand that the finding out, if you will, would have come from Sarai rather than from Abraham. So no doubt the Pharaoh has sent out messengers or soldiers, or probably both, to go out and to collect Abraham and bring him back to the palace to explain himself. So I'm just going to pop on another slide. And on this slide, there's some pictures there. At the bottom corner, you can see the Sphinx again with the pyramids in the background as it is today. And you can see it's a very barren and dry land. But once again, in ancient times, these lands were not dry and barren. They were very, very fertile. In modern day times, there's control on all of the river, on the Nile River, with cataracts and dams used for irrigation, etc. So it's changed the nature of the landscape, whereas in the ancient times they had these natural floods, and these natural floods would actually, as you can pretty much imagine, green the surrounding environment on either side of the river. So for Abraham to go from where he was, he would have had to leave his livestock behind, and his nephew was there, Lot, and they would have remained with the shepherds while he went off to the palace. Now, to go to the palace, he would have had to cross over to the other side of the Nile River. So they were on the eastern side. He would have crossed over to the western side of the Nile River, and he would have actually travelled past the Giza Plateau. Now the Giza Plateau is so called because it's a very flat area, as the pictures show you there. Now he would have seen something similar to these pictures which I've popped up here, these illustrations. You would have seen this lush green environment, and upon that environment would have been this extraordinarily large pyramid, and of course the Sphinx, which was in construction. So as he travelled past this Giza Plateau, he would have seen the most imposing structure that he had ever seen. In fact, it was the biggest building on the earth at the time, and that was the Great Pyramid of Giza. Now you've got to remember, the biggest thing that he'd seen before this would have been the ziggurats from where he came in the city of Ur, but now he was seeing something even much bigger than what he'd experienced before. So this structure would have been incredibly impressive to him, and it would have seemed to literally rise into the sky, and it probably would have had the effect of creating some fear upon Abraham, because he would have realized that anybody who could build such a structure must have been very powerful. So he would take from that, because of what's happened with his wife, that the pharaoh could pretty much do anything that he wanted, especially because he was in his own land and he was the king. So travelling a bit further south, he would have saw yet another strange monument, and it's something that he would never have seen before. And of course it was this body of a lion lying down, but it had the head of a human. So he would have been looking at that thinking, what strange thing was this? So of course Abraham had come across the largest stone monument on earth at the time, and again we've mentioned this a few times now, but this was actually the Sphinx. So intimidated by all that he would have seen, Abraham would have been glad that he had chosen to deceive the Egyptians when he told them that his wife was his sister, because all of this would have been confirming to him how powerful these people were and how he didn't want to have any problem with them. So arriving at the palace of the Pharaoh, Abraham was asked by the Pharaoh some questions as to what was actually he was doing and what he was thinking. We can read this in Genesis, and it's in chapter 12 verse 19, and it reads, "Why didn't you tell me she was your wife? Why did you say she is my sister, so that I took her to be my wife? Now then, here is your wife, take her and go." So clearly the Pharaoh, when he was questioning him, now knew that she was in fact Abraham's wife. The question was, why did he say it was his sister? And of course, because God had sent these diseases upon the Pharaoh and his family, all he wanted to do was to get rid of them. So at this point in time, he says, "Now then, here is your wife, take her and go." So Abraham had concealed the truth, and by so doing, he actually exposed his wife and the Egyptians to sin. Most noted for his extraordinary faith that brought him out of Ur, Abraham yielded himself to unbelief and distrust of God's divine providence. But God, who is perfect in every way, he delivered Abraham from his own sin and his own folly. Pharaoh's reproof was in fact very just. He was upset at him, and so he should have been, because Abraham had actually lied. So sending him away, he was actually very kind, because you could imagine these days he could have just had him killed. He could have been angry enough to have him killed, but he must have had a reverence for God, because he understood that the things that would actually happen to him in terms of disease and illness on him and his family, he must have understood that that was connected to the God of Abraham, who was protecting him and causing this disease to happen in order to have Sarai released. So Abraham had subjected himself to fears that were altogether groundless, and he walked himself into trouble. So this is something for us to think about today. Oftentimes we start off with a bit of worry, and we let that turn into doubt, and then that develops into fear. And before we know it, we've actually walked ourselves into the very problem that we're going to avoid. And of course, this is what Abraham did. He tried to second guess something that hadn't happened, and in fact it then did happen. And as you can see from the way that the story tells us, the Pharaoh didn't actually kill him at the end of the day. He actually released him, And of course he was blessed because when he left, he ended up with more livestock and more wealth than when he had arrived there. So this question of Abraham's visit to Egypt, it stirs up a lot of questions. We could ask, how could he and why did he? But this answer simply reflects the fallen nature of humankind. Abraham too was not perfect, and he too had a sin nature despite knowing God. You and I might think, well, how on earth could he if he'd actually met God face to face? You couldn't imagine doing that. And yet we know that right from the time of Adam, in the beginning of the Bible, that he used to walk with God. And God told him one thing. He said, don't eat off the tree of knowledge of good and evil. And yet he did. So unfortunately, Abraham and each and every one of us since that point in time, we sin despite our faith and knowing God, and we're not perfect. So is the case for Abraham. So this incident teaches us that no matter how unworthy Abraham was, that God, however, kept his promise. He would not let anything prevent its fulfillment. We can trust in God. Now, in 2 Timothy in the New Testament, in chapter 2, verse 13, it says, if we are faithless, he will remain faithful, for he cannot disown himself. So in other words, God is perfect and holy, and he will not be faithless, and he will always be faithful to us because of whom he actually is. So that's a great comfort to each and every one of us. So as a consequence of all of this, Abraham left Egypt, and the Bible tells us in Genesis chapter 13, verse 1, that he went up from Egypt to the Negev, going from place to place until he came to Bethel, to the place between Bethel and Ai, where his tent had been earlier, and where he had first built an altar. There Abraham called on the name of the Lord. So this is in Genesis 13, verses 3 to 4. Now, when it says here that he built an altar and Abraham called on the name of the Lord, when we say he called on the name of the Lord, we're basically talking about prayer. So Abraham, when he went back after he'd been disobedient and he hadn't walked with the Lord, he got himself into trouble, and the only way that he'd been released was because of the covenantal promise of a father who loved him and took care of him in order to ensure that he didn't break his promise to Abraham, despite the fact that Abraham had done the wrong thing with him. So this is why I say that Abraham had stopped communicating with God, because from the time he left to the time he came back, there was no mention of him building altars, there was no mention of him calling on the name of the Lord, and yet once he arrives back, it's the first thing that he actually does. So tested with a famine, Abraham's faith had wavered. He'd sinned, and his sin had infected those around him. But punished and rescued by God, he returned to where he came from. So his relationship was restored at the altar, where he once again called on the name of the Lord. Now, having arrived back, both Abraham and his nephew Lot, they became very wealthy and accumulated an immense number of livestock. And in Genesis chapter 13, verse 7, it says, and quarrelling arose between Abraham's herdsmen and the herdsmen of Lot. But Abraham did not want this to continue, so he and Lot decided to part company. Now Lot chose what's known as the plain of Jordan, and the Bible in Genesis chapter 13, verse 10 says, it was well watered like the garden of the Lord, like the land of Egypt toward Zoar, and pitched his tents near Sodom, which is in Genesis 13, verse 12. Now Abraham, on the other hand, he moved his camp eventually, and he settled near the great trees of Mamre at Hebron, which we can find in Genesis chapter 13, verse 18. So we can understand here that they've come back, their livestock's kept multiplying as they journeyed all the way from Haran down to Egypt and back. Of course, the pharaoh had bequeathed them with much more livestock, and it's obviously got to a point in time where there's so much livestock that they're competing for the same resources, and you can imagine the confusion in actually sorting out whose animals were whose. So when we have a look at these plains of Jordan today, I'm just going to pop on a slide here. This is what it actually looks like, and you can see it's just a barren wasteland. Now, in the background on that picture, you can see Jordan itself, which is on the opposite side of the Dead Sea. So at this point in time, we're at the bottom of the Dead Sea. So the Jordan River has ceased to flow. This is what's known as the Arabah. So this travels all the way down to Elat at the top of the Red Sea today. And it remains like this, just this dry, barren wasteland. But if you have a look at it, it's got all these alluvial deposits. So there was a time where the river flowed through here in the past, and this would have been all green and lush grazing ground. You can see the scale of it, it's very large. And we'll come to this a bit later on in the following this journey, but there's a time with Sodom and Gomorrah where some evil happens, and God actually turns this into this barren wasteland, and to this very day it continues to remain as this barren wasteland. So looking at that picture, you can see this vast area. It would have had the river flowing, and it would have been green for grazing. So this is the very place where Lot had actually moved to and settled with his flocks. So going back to the map, the bottom of the Dead Sea there, which is underneath that piece of scripture, is where Lot is, and of course Mamre is at Hebron. So if you look at the side of the Dead Sea there, you'll see where Hebron is. It was known as Kiriath Arba in the day, and it's a little bit further north east of Be'er Sheva, where he had left from. So this is the place at Mamre there that Abraham settled. Okay, so although Abraham had sinned, God had rescued and restored him back to the land of the covenant, which of course is the land of Canaan. Now it's here at Mamre, remembering that Abraham is a foreigner in the land of Canaan, that the word Hebrew is first recorded. Now I did mention in the previous video when they came into the land of Canaan at Be'er Sheva, that would have been the first time that they were called Hebrew because of the meaning of the word. But at this particular place, this is the first time that it's actually recorded, and I'm talking about the fact that it's recorded in the Bible. Now, Hebrew in its own language, as a word, is Ivri, I-V-R-I. Now, that actually comes from the word ever, which is spelt as we'd expect, E-V-E-R, and it actually means the other side. So the first use for this term is in Genesis chapter 14, verse 13, and it refers to Abram the Ivri or Abram the Hebrew. Now, describing Abraham as a Hebrew is what actually sets him apart from other people, because as we know, he was born in Ur, so he was a person from the other side. And when we talk about the other side, we're talking east of Canaan and the Jordan River, and from the other side of the Euphrates River. So at this point in time, Abraham is now on the eastern side, and on the western side, and formerly he was on the eastern side. So this is something that sets him apart from all other people now that he's settled there in the land of Canaan. Okay, so that brings us to the end of this lesson with Abraham's journey down to Egypt and back. I hope I've been able to sort of open the topic up a little bit and give you a bit of insight into some of the dating and the pharaohs, what Abraham would have seen when he travelled, and also some of the understanding of what was actually going on when God tested him and he failed to be obedient, and of course what happened to him as a consequence. Of course he learnt his lesson, he came back to the land, and as the Bible tells us, he once again built an altar to the Lord and returned to prayer, so returned to talking to his Father in heaven. Now, in the next lesson, we're going to be having a look at idols in the Bible before we follow this journey any further. The reason for doing that is that to understand the Bible, there's many idols that are actually mentioned there, and it's talked about how they were, evil things. People used to do evil things. They used to worship them for various reasons. They used to make sacrifices to appease these false gods, and they also used to tie up all of their superstitions and beliefs for the quality of their life in these gods. But of course, Abraham had been called out of that, and he was now in a monotheistic relationship with God, so only one God that he was in relationship, and he no longer worshipped any of these idols. But of course, moving into the land of Canaan and settling there, he was exposed to those who lived around him, who of course did worship these other false idols. So before we go any further, I'm going to show and discuss a number of these false idols, so you can actually understand in context what it was like to live in those times. And the Bible continuously tells us how they did abominable things and how disgusted God was in the worship of these idols. So I just want to explain what all those idols are to you, and that'll give you a good insight and understanding. So as you travel through the journey of faith, as I'm taking you on all the way through the Bible, every time those idols which come up repetitively in the Old Testament, you're going to have some understanding of who they were and what they actually believed about those idols. So I hope that's something that will help to illuminate the Bible and bring it to life, and to give you some insight and understanding with those very things that Abraham was exposed to. So thank you for joining me. I'm just going to pop on this slide. This lesson and all the previous and the future lessons, they're all from this book that I've been working on for many years called The Journey to Faith. And we're basically following the genealogy of Jesus, which is provided in the first book of Matthew from verses 1 to 13. And we're following this genealogy of Jesus from Abraham as the father of the faith, whom God called out and to make a people of his own. And of course, we're learning at the moment how the covenant promise was made to him, and how the land of Canaan has been bequeathed to him by God, and that he would have many descendants. And of course, from those, the birth of our Lord Jesus Christ would come. So in 2019, we're going to be releasing this book, so I'll let you know when that happens. So please avail yourself of a copy. Now, when we go to the next slide, there will be a little tab on the bottom of the slide, and that will actually be a picture of the next lesson, which you can click on and continue on this journey with me. And on the other side of the page will appear a picture of my face, as I say, funnily enough. And if you actually press on that, it's actually a subscribe button, so you can subscribe to the Jesus Movement channel on YouTube. And when you do that, there's a little bell symbol beside the subscribe button, a red subscribe button. And if you press that little bell, it'll actually send you notifications for each of these lessons as they're released into the future for you to enjoy. So I thank you for joining me. I pray that you've enjoyed this lesson. I pray that it's opening up your mind as to the life and times in these ancient times, and exploring the reality of the Bible and the Scripture. And I look forward to your company in the following lesson. So that's it from me, and I will speak to you in the next lesson. Bye for now.